NC pork, good for the plate, great for the state. Welcome to Timeout here on the North Carolina Sports Network. I am Mike Waddell, and as we hit the Sweet 16 of the NCAA tournament, the ACC storyline is simple. 8 lead teams went in, 1 team remains. The top-seeded Duke Blue Devils are carrying the conference into the second weekend. And coming up in today's show, David Glenn and I will break down Duke, their matchup, and what it will take to keep the Blue Devils moving towards the road to Indianapolis. We'll also go around the bracket, the games that matter, the upset alerts, and the team that could become America's next tournament darling. Then we will turn the page to North Carolina, because what's happening in Chapel Hill right now is bigger than just one loss. It's about direction, it's about leadership, and it's about whether the program is being guided or is it reacting. Joining me, David Glenn, our award-winning sports writer and sportscaster who has become one of the most accurate NCAA brackets in our bacon and basketball promotion. Let's get into it, David. Duke is the only ACC team left. And before we dive deeper into the Blue Devils' ongoing story, among the ACC's other 7 teams in this year's Big Dance, you had predicted almost all of those early departures. How did you see those coming, and which ACC teams did you think would ultimately fall short of their potential?
Yeah, Mike, it's great to be with you again. Happy March Madness once again. And I think that most of what we saw from the rest of the ACC was predictable, just as Duke still standing in the Sweet 16 and perhaps beyond also was predictable. Really quickly, you and I and Coach Kerry Keating in our Timeout show have been talking for much of 4 months about some of the things that we saw unfold in the first 4 or the round of 64 or the round of 32. Working from the bottom up, what did we say about SMU all year long? Mustangs were fun to watch under Andy Enfield, but at some point their inability to stop people was going to bite the Mustangs. Sure enough, a Miami of Ohio team that was 32-1 going into that matchup in the first 4 against SMU put up 89 points against the Mustangs. Heck of a season overall for SMU. Just getting into the Big Dance hasn't happened often for that program in recent decades, but a predictable ending. Similarly, number 11 seed NC State. What did we say about the Wolfpack all year long under first-year coach Will Wade? Problems on defense, which actually got better late and were even better in that loss to Texas, but problems on the boards. The Longhorns dominated NC State on the backboards, a lot of second chance points, a lot of offensive rebounds. Pack falls in a close one, 68-66, just as they had fallen in a close one to Texas during the regular season, but a predictable ending to year 1 of the Will Wade era in Raleigh. Clemson, number 8 seed. They lose to Iowa, technically a lower seed, but 8 versus 9, there's really no favorite. The Tigers had not enough offensive firepower all year long. Great defense under Brad Brownell, great chemistry. They ran the same offense they've been running for a long time. They just didn't have quite as much talent to execute that offense. And when one of their star big men, Carter Welling, got hurt at the ACC tournament, that was one more hurdle. So no surprise that the Tigers went out in the round of 64. Continuing up the ladder, Miami was a 7 seed. They had an impressive first-round win over Missouri, but when you're a 7 seed, you're probably going to run into a 2 seed in the round of 32. That's what happened. Number 2 seed Purdue Boilermakers under Matt Painter have done a lot of great things in the NCAA tournament. They eliminate the Hurricanes, but let's just remember, Jay Lucas's first year with the Canes was an overwhelming success story. From 7 or so wins last year to way over 20 wins this year. One of the greatest single season turnarounds we've ever seen in the win column for a single program. Strong starting 5 for Jay Lucas. Little depth was the concern we talked about for the Canes at the ACC tournament and heading into the NCAA tournament. That lack of depth in support of the star point guard Trey Donaldson, the star big man Malik Renew, and the rest of that starting 5. Eventually, when you face a 2 seed, you need more than a strong starting 5. Canes didn't have it, so they go home in the round of 32. Number 6, Louisville, we had circled as a possible team for the Sweet 16. And then what happened? After the Cardinals told us that star freshman point guard Michael Brown Jr. would be eligible, or available rather, after his back problems at the NCAA tournament, after we saw him, standing during the ACC tournament in support of his teammates to protect his back issues, he, of course, did not play in the NCAA tournament. Louisville beats South Florida in the first round, but falls again to a higher seed, Michigan State 77-69 in the second round. We're left to wonder what if for Pat Kelsey's second team at Louisville. A solid season overall, disappointing compared to their preseason expectations. But what if NBA lottery pick Michael Brown Jr. had been healthy? We'll just never know. The two teams, Mike, that might have left something on the vine, so to speak. These 7 ACC teams that have exited, frankly, 5 of the 7 weren't going any further than they did. Virginia as a 3 seed and Carolina as a 6 seed are the 2 exceptions. We're going to talk more about the Tar Heels later, but you don't need me to say that losing a 19-point second half lead is about as ugly as it gets, and it's one of the reasons that so much of Carolina Nation jumped on the fire Hubert Davis train. You just can't cough up that kind of a lead in the second half, even against a solid opponent like VCU. Tar Heels lose in overtime. We'll get into Hubert later, but I thought Henry Vessar showed up. I saw Derek Dixon, the freshman point guard, Jaron Stevenson, the veteran forward. I thought they mostly showed up, but the Heels got the cold version of Luka Bogovac. They got almost nothing from their bench again, a group that really lost confidence late in the season. So in that sense, we did not have the Heels going to the Sweet 16, but it was a bit surprising at least how they lost to VCU in the round of 64. And then Virginia, again, great debut for Ryan Odom. There are no javelins to be thrown here. UVA gets that win over Wright State, but then does fall to a lower seed. That always hurts. It was number 6 seed Tennessee of Rick Barnes eliminating the Cavaliers 79-72 in the second round. My bottom line there, and again, that was a well-constructed roster, good balance between offense and defense, a lot of experience, really well coached by Ryan Odom. In the end, Tennessee's star guards played better than UVA's guards. And Jakari White, great three-point shooter, was cold against Tennessee. Sam Lewis, great driver and offensive performer, a little bit cold against Tennessee. And Tennessee's best guards played really, really well. So that the Heels and the Wahoos maybe left a little bit more that could have been theirs. But again, in 5 of those 7 cases, eminently predictable what happened to the ACC. And now only Duke is left to carry the ACC torch.
So Duke survived Siena. They control TCU. Do they look like a Final Four team to you, DG?
They do, and I had them in the Final Four. I don't have them as my national champion because of their health concerns, because of some three-point shooting ups and downs, because of their good but not always great point guard play. Those have been among the things we've followed here on our shows for 4+ months now. I do think Duke's better than St. John's, but that's going to be a tough matchup. And Mike, that Siena game, I think, scared a lot of Duke fans. Heck, imagine how Duke fans would have been out in force on John Shire. They're still angry that he let that lead get away against Houston in the Final Four last year. Imagine if he had lost to Siena in the round of 64. I mean, that ended up being, remember, Blue Devils 71, Siena 65. You used the word survive, and that's the right term because Siena was this close to adding its name to UMBC, 16 seed over UVA as a number 1, and Fairleigh Dickinson, 16 seed over Purdue as a number 1. Those are the only 2 examples that we've ever had in the big bracket since they started seeding it. And the Devils trailed Siena by 11 points at the half. And at one point, they were down 13 against the number 16 seed of Jerry McNamara, who's now the head coach at Syracuse in the ACC. But Duke looked tight in that game. John Shire said he was outcoached by Jerry McNamara. Cam Boozer said later after the game that the Devils simply didn't come out, quote, ready to play. You can get away with that against Siena. You're not getting away with that against the St. John's team or if they survive St. John's against either UConn or Michigan State in the Elite Eight. There's only 7 active coaches with NCAA championship rings, and 3 of them are in John Shire's bracket, right? It's Rick Pitino of St. John's and Tom Izzo of Michigan State and Dan Hurley of UConn. So this is not going to be an easy road for Duke. They need to shoot better. They were really cold against Siena in that game. 5 for 26 from three-point range. Devils also got almost nothing from their bench against Siena. That has to change. Some things are getting better. Caden Boozer at point guard has been a much better version of himself late in the ACC tournament and first week of the NCAA tournament. Cameron Boozer is still Cameron Boozer, National Player of the Year, and the rock on which everything else Duke does is built. But you're not going to win it all. You're not even going to go to the Final Four if Cam Boozer doesn't get enough help. That's among the questions as we look forward to the St. John's matchup and maybe others after that.
Every team has a vulnerability. What is Duke's?
Well, I think it's some of the things that I just briefly referred to. Caden Boozer, we don't know if Caleb Foster's coming back. John Shire did mention this week that we might see Caleb Foster here in week 2 after we weren't sure we're going to see him at all. And originally, remember, they said most likely not until the Final Four next week if the Blue Devils make it that far. Uncertain point guard play is always a scary thing. Again, the good news, Caden Boozer has gotten better. The bad news is when Mike Krzyzewski won 5 NCAA titles, there was never a doubt at point guard. It was Bobby Hurley the first 2 times. It was a combination of Jay Williams and Chris Duhon in the early 2000s. It was the combination of Nolan Smith and John Shire, 2 veterans, when Coach K won it all in 2010. And then it was another combination, right? Tyus Jones and the veteran Quinn Cook in 2015. Not every one of those guys was a superstar, but there was not much of a roller coaster when it came to how those guys played, especially late in the season. I don't think we can call the combination of Caleb Foster and Caden Boozer that rock solid. So we'll see how that turns out. Beyond that, the cold shooting. You know that St. John's is not going to let Isaiah Evans get many three-point shots. If it happens, it will be because of a defensive miscommunication, because I promise you, Rick Pitino's game plan is going to start with a plan for Cam Boozer, whatever he draws up as the wizard that he can be. It's going to continue with not giving Isaiah Evans open three-point shots, and then we'll see how it unfolds from there. But Evans was 2 for 8 in that Siena game. Caden Boozer's not a good three-point shooter. Cam Boozer is a good three-point shooter, but made only 1 of 5. Dame Sarr, who was really good from long range against TCU. And remember, Duke was in a close game against the Horned Frogs, but then just blew them out in the second half in the round of 32. Why? Well, Dame Sarr was 0 for 4 from 3 against Siena. And if he misses his first or second, I think he loses confidence as a freshman, even as a future NBA player. When he makes 1 or 2, he seems to want the ball and feel like the next one's going in. That's what he did in that game against TCU. But three-point shooting can go either way for the Blue Devils. Point guard, relatively speaking, is not as strong as it usually is. And Pat Gongba, coming back from an injury, was not very good against TCU after not playing against Siena. Will there be timing issues for Gongba moving forward? You know, he fumbled a couple of balls underneath. He was a little slow getting to rebounds and loose balls. Will Caleb Foster deal with some of those same kind of timing chemistry issues if and when he comes back from his injury? Those are a lot of variables. Again, Duke is one of the most talented teams in the country. That's the starting point. Duke has Cam Boozer. You continue with that solid anchor. Beyond that, this is not a super heavyweight Duke team compared to some of the teams that they'll have to beat to cut down the nets this year. So Devils are still one of the favorites, but they're also in a bracket with those 3 national championship coaches that, given the Blue Devils sometimes ups and downs offensively, it ain't going to be easy in this second weekend, just as it turned out to not be very easy on the first weekend for the Blue Devils.
Let's go around the brackets now. And what are the most interesting big picture storylines that you're following between now and that Monday in Indianapolis when they crown the champion?
Yeah, for our purposes at the North Carolina Sports Network, one storyline, of course, is whether Duke's John Shire, who has done everything except win a national championship during his first 3+ seasons here as the head coach of the Blue Devils, whether he can win it all with a very talented rotation, but one that is not completely healthy and does have a handful of flaws. But in terms of that national, broader, big picture, I'll give you three. Number one, the Big Ten. You've worked in the Big Ten, Mike. You probably heard this storyline at some point in the last quarter century. This conference has not had one of its schools win the national championship in men's basketball since the year 2000, or 26 years ago. It was Tom Izzo and Michigan State who cut down the nets that year. And the Big Ten has had plenty of teams in the Final Four, even 8 trips to the national championship games since 2000. But it has been the ACC with 8 national championships and the Big East with 8 national championships, winning a lot of titles since the turn of the century. The SEC has a handful. The Big 12 has a handful as well. But the Big Ten has been stuck on 0 for a true quarter century at this point. Entering the Sweet 16, of course, who has the most teams still standing? It is the Big Ten with 6. Michigan is a very strong number 1 seed in the Midwest. Purdue is a solid number 2 in the West. Illinois is a really dangerous offensive powerhouse as a number 3 seed in the South. And you also have number 3 Michigan State, number 4 Nebraska, number 9 Iowa, also still alive. Although those latter 3, in my opinion, might not have enough to make a serious run at an NCAA title. Second big picture angle for you, the head coaches. There are only 7 active head coaches who have won a national championship. As I mentioned earlier, here they are: Dan Hurley of UConn, Todd Golden of Florida, Scott Drew of Baylor, John Calipari now of Arkansas, and then 3 other guys who might be near retirement. It's Bill Self of Kansas, who's only in his early 60s but has been dealing with health issues. Rick Pitino, of course, of St. John's, who's 73 years old, and then Tom Izzo of Michigan State, who's 71 years old. Izzo and Pitino, of course, still battling John Shire in that quadrant of the bracket. Obviously, it would be a crowning achievement for any of these guys to add their names to that prestigious list, and almost all of the favorites are led by men who would be first-time NCAA champions, at least as a head coach. The number 1 seeds still standing are led by Tommy Lloyd at Arizona, Dusty May at Michigan, and of course, John Shire at Duke. The number 2 seeds include Matt Painter at Purdue, Kelvin Sampson at Houston, and TJ Otzelberger at Iowa State, plus Danny Hurley of UConn, who does already have 2 rings. But most of these guys that I just mentioned still have plenty of time to reach and chase the ultimate prize. But remember, Kelvin Sampson, a guy born here in Laurinburg, North Carolina, a former player and a graduate of what is now called UNC Pembroke. He's now 70 years old as the Houston Cougars head coach, so he's running out of chances to cut down the nets. Hurley, Calipari, Pitino, and Izzo still alive in the Sweet 16. They've already been to the mountaintop as a head coach. Any of these other 12, including 38-year-old John Shire of Duke, would be a first-timer in that regard. And that is also going to be a fascinating angle to watch the rest of the way. Third and final big picture item: for the first 40 years of the NCAA tournament's modern format, meaning this supersized 64 or now 68 team bracket, starting in 1985, there had always, Mike, always for 40 years running, been 1 or more teams from outside the power conferences in the Sweet 16. Last year, there was not one. This year, there is not one. So after 40 straight years of that never happening, now it's happened 2 years in a row where the entire Sweet 16 is made up of teams from the power conferences. I think the explanation, briefly, is part mathematical, part financial. First, for decades, the power conferences were smaller leagues, so they might have had a combined 50 teams. Now those same leagues are supersized, right? The ACC, for example, has gone from 8 teams in 1985 to now 18 teams in 2026. So just from a mathematical or numerical standpoint, the Power 5, as they're now called, are going to gobble up a larger number and higher percentage of those Sweet 16 slots. The other main factor as you know, perhaps better than I, and we've discussed many times on our platforms here on the North Carolina Sports Network, we're living in a new world where the gap between the haves and the have-nots has grown even larger because of things like revenue sharing. We're in year 1 of that. And name, image, likeness money. We're in year 5 of that. That financial gap has gotten bigger. Power conference schools can afford to spend that 20.5 million plus in revenue sharing, a nice chunk of that going to basketball. They have more resources for name, image, likeness, etc., far more than those outside the Power 5 conferences. So if you're looking for Cinderella, you have to look in a different way now, because again, for 2 years running, the entirety of these 16-team brackets have been comprised of power conference schools.
Everything about this tournament revolves around one thing, brother. It's the upset. Who's going to pull the big upset that we're looking forward to seeing either on Thursday, Friday, or maybe even Saturday or Sunday?
Yeah, that's hard to say. I don't see a lot of difference between number 4 seed Nebraska and number 9 seed Iowa. So the Hawkeyes would technically be an underdog. That's a pretty massive seed disadvantage. And the Hawkeyes are certainly capable of beating Nebraska. We're going to talk a little bit more about the Cornhuskers' fascinating story a little bit later. I think Illinois, because of that explosive offense I described, I don't know if it would be a huge upset, but the Illini are a 3. Houston, really, really well coached as always on defense by Kelvin Sampson, is a 2 seed. And remember, Iowa State against Tennessee, the Cyclones are a 2 seed, but their best player, the big man Jefferson, got injured on the first weekend. Now, they say he's probably going to come back, at least as we're having this conversation. So you'd have to consider Tennessee an upset possibility as a 6 seed over number 2 seed Iowa State. But if Jefferson plays, I like the Cyclones. I actually picked them to go to the Final Four. Didn't know about that injury at that point, but those are among those that I would say I have on upset watch here going into the second weekend of the NCAA tournament.
So, DG, every year there's a national sweetheart. Who's going to be this year's Loyola, or back in the day Gonzaga, which they're now a power team, but who's going to be that national sweetheart that everybody is going cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs for and going to Fanatics to get their big shirt for the Final Four?
Yeah, Mike, it's a good question, but it's a weird question this year, right? Because of the lack of anybody from outside the Power 5 leagues. But my answer is Nebraska, and it's a no-brainer. This is already the greatest basketball season in the history of that university, because it is a team with a sparkling 28-6 record, and it's the program's first ever trip to the Sweet 16. The Cornhuskers, Mike, have been playing basketball since 1897. That's a long wait for the Sweet 16, and everyone knows that they've been far more famous for football and other things for decade after decade. They've won only a single conference tournament in their entire men's basketball history. That was back in 1994 in the old Big 8 conference. The Cornhuskers haven't won a regular season conference title in any league since 1950, long before you or I were born. And this is only their 3rd NCAA tournament trip in the last 25 plus years. The Cornhuskers coach, Fred Hoiberg, was actually born in Lincoln, Nebraska, home of the Huskers, of course, although he played at Iowa State in college and then for more than a decade in the NBA. Hoiberg had such great success as a head coach at his alma mater that the NBA's Chicago Bulls came calling, and he spent 4 seasons in the pros before getting the call at Nebraska. Now this is his 7th season with the Cornhuskers, so it has been a slow build. He did not have a winning record at Nebraska until his 5th year, but now he has the Huskers in the Sweet 16, and they are slight favorites, as I mentioned, against Iowa to get to the Elite 8. That fan base, Mike, has gone absolutely bonkers for Nebraska basketball, as you might guess, and especially in the absence of those more traditional Cinderellas from outside the power leagues. The Cornhuskers are as close to a Cinderella story as you're going to get this year, unless you want to adopt Iowa just because the Hawkeyes are a 9 seed, or Texas just because the Longhorns are an 11 seed, although it's hard for me to call one of the wealthiest athletic departments in America, meaning Texas, any kind of a Cinderella story, regardless of their seed.
Every great team has a winning playbook, and every great meal, it starts with North Carolina pork. Bacon for the early tip breakfast, pulled pork at the arena. That's how you win the day. Behind every bite, NC pig farmers fuel more than $10 billion in economic impact statewide. Great teams execute. Great meals deliver. North Carolina pork. Game on, grill on. Learn more at ncpork.org.
For our veterans, the end of their service is just the beginning. It may come with new careers and new chaos. There might be late nights, school drops, and even haircuts. That's where we come in, providing more than $1 million a year in career-building scholarship funds and discounts on every haircut for our veterans. Just trying to do our part to make their lives a little easier. Sport Clips Haircuts, supporting veterans everywhere.
So let's talk about what everybody's been waiting for the last 20 minutes to talk about, because we're all excited about the tournament, but just like in the real world these days, I guess this is the real world, but everybody likes the drama. And boy, we got a big heaping helping of it coming out of Greenville in the Bon Secours Arena last week with North Carolina's first round exit. The unfolding drama in Chapel Hill folding as we speak. By the time we get this on the air, something might already have dropped, and we'll come back and cover that right here on the North Carolina Sports Network. But with the Tar Heels and Hubert Davis, you got a young head coach, DG, at a blue blood program, no previous head coaching experience. He was the number 3, not the 1, Steve Robinson, not the 2, Brad Frederick, but the number 3 assistant coach behind Roy Williams, who he follows. The legend in the early years have been uneven. There are system changes perhaps going through in the back end. Anytime you have transition, that's going to happen, even when it's an internal transition. There has been lots of roster turnover, 13 new Tar Heels this past year wearing that familiar jersey. And the program isn't quite what people expect yet. There's a stretch of inconsistency. There's a bad loss last week against Virginia Commonwealth, 19 points from 15 a few years ago at the half of the national championship game when the Tar Heels were up on Kansas. The noise is building, and I told you before we started taping this broadcast that when I worked at Carolina in the early 90s, and that's where you and I met, I can't imagine at any time a former player speaking out against the program. We saw that a few years ago for the first time with Rashad McCants, and everybody just unified against him. But now, DG, boy, the voices are starting to really rise up, and it's been an interesting thing to watch unfold.
It has, Mike, and it's a tricky call because, as we've said before, Hubert Davis's resume is a mixed bag. I understand why Carolina will make a change, assuming Carolina does make a change. But let's be real about this. Hubert Davis has in his column a regular season title in the ACC just 2 years ago, a trip to the national championship game in his first year. If you can't coach, you don't go into Cameron Indoor Stadium and send Mike Krzyzewski into retirement by beating the Blue Devils on a multi-generational sort of celebration of Coach K Day, and then follow up by eliminating him from the Final Four at the NCAA tournament just a few weeks later. It's unfair to Hubert Davis to say something like he can't coach. You don't do the things I just described if you can't coach. However, Hubert Davis has felt for much of his 5 years in Chapel Hill like an awkward fit as the head coach of the Tar Heels, not only for the reasons that you outlined there, but for example, I have interviewed every ACC head coach in men's basketball for almost 40 years now. And for whatever reason, and I say this as somebody who has known Hubert Davis personally since he was in his late teens, he and I were in school together. We overlapped during our time in Chapel Hill. I visited his home in Virginia to write a long form article about his upbringing and the sad death of his mother many years ago. And of course, his uncle Walter Davis, who has his own special place in the history of Carolina basketball, and his great relationship with his mom, and his discovery of his faith during his time in Chapel Hill, and meeting his wife, etc. I know every layer of the man's stories, and to this day, I might have written personally the longest form article on Hubert Davis in the history of the world. I'm not sure that's an exaggeration, right? So I know him well. When you know somebody well, Mike, usually conversations are easier. They're smoother. No one's defensive, right? I've known Brad Brownell at Clemson for many, many years. Why is he so open and easy and fun to talk to when he visits? I've known Coach K for 40 years. He has visited our modern edition of the David Glenn Show, even in retirement, and we have wonderful, fun, easygoing conversations. Why? In part because there's a 40-year relationship there. Same with Roy Williams and so many other luminaries who join our platforms here on the North Carolina Sports Network. Even though I have an even deeper and farther back relationship with Hubert Davis, when I ask Hubert Davis a simple question about his relationship with UNC basketball GM Jim Tanner, he reacts as if I'm asking a question about the Pentagon Papers or some other secret that can't be shared with the outside world. I mean, it's a simple, non-threatening question. As somebody who played in the NBA, where the general manager head coach relationship works a certain way, how do you describe how your relationship works with Jim Tanner behind the curtains at UNC? Again, it's a question every coach gets from many reporters, and it should not be a difficult question to answer. And yet Hubert Davis seemed awkward in that context, even being asked a simple question multiple times. He seemed awkward after the VCU loss. Why did you use your starters for so many minutes? Because I decided to. Hubert Davis is a wonderful person. I've never heard anyone discuss him in any other terms than a wonderful human being. But I use the phrase sometimes, comfortable in your own skin. When Hubert Davis is asked to venture outside friendly questions from, let's say, in-house questioners, whether it's somebody employed by UNC or during his ESPN days, he could prepare for TV segments by knowing what questions were coming, and sometimes by begging off questions that he might not want to answer all on the air by eliminating those during the show preparation. Hubert does not seem comfortable in his own skin for reasons that I don't understand, because I think the authentic Hubert Davis, the honest, genuine Hubert Davis, would do well if he proverbially let his hair down and just spoke from the heart in most contexts. You can't always share everything, but Hubert's such a good guy that I think if he let the walls come down, he would be a better communicator than he is. But in this league right now, to be a recruiter, you need to be comfortable in your own skin. To be a game day magician or orchestrator, you need to be comfortable in your own skin. Dealing with the media, dealing with parents, dealing with high school coaches, dealing with agents nowadays. You have to be really comfortable in your own skin. And whereas I can promise you, John Shire of Duke is comfortable in his own skin. Jay Lucas of Miami, who I haven't known for nearly as long, has had much more easy, free-going, non-threatening, non-confrontational, not defensive-minded. Why are you asking that question? What are you trying to get at? Is this some kind of gotcha situation? There's none of that paranoia with Luke Laux of Florida State, or Jay Lucas at Miami, or John Shire at Duke, or Brad Brownell at Clemson, or Ryan Odom at Virginia, or so many of the other coaches that we follow in the ACC or around the state of North Carolina. Hubert doesn't feel comfortable in his own skin. Hubert doesn't seem comfortable with the way modern college athletics works. There's nothing wrong with saying that a young person should care about the name on the front of the jersey, meaning UNC, more than the name on the back of the jersey, right? There's nothing wrong with that principle, and Hubert should stay married to that principle. But you have to do it in a world where there are going to be more one-and-done players. There are going to be more one-year incoming transfers. And he has had some success with those kinds of guys, Henry Vessar, Harrison Ingram, Cormac Ryan, Brady Manick, etc. but he seems uncomfortable with many aspects of his job. Remember, at the end of Dean Smith's tenure, he said he still loved practice, he still loved games, he still loved being a basketball coach and a teacher of young men. But Coach Smith said in the mid-1990s he got tired of, quote unquote, the other stuff. Hubert Davis seems tired of the other stuff, and all along I think he's been uncomfortable with the other stuff. So some have described him as unhappy with those other aspects of his job, just as Dean Smith ultimately became unhappy with those other aspects of his job. The other part is just results, right? Roy Williams' final 4 years, remember, he wins the national title in 2017. Over Roy Williams' next 4 years, people could look up the details if they want. There was one very good year. There was one horrific year, remember 14 and 19, and then there were 2 mediocre years. So when Roy Williams, toward the end of his career, looked at that 4-year span after his national title, one good, really good, one really bad, 2 in the middle, he decided that wasn't good enough. And remember, when people were asking Roy Williams, are you out because of name, image, likeness? Are you out because of agents? Are you out because of one and done or any other aspect of modern college basketball? Coach Williams swore that even though he didn't like some of those things, he swore that the primary reason he retired was that he no longer thought that he was good enough to do that job to the Carolina standard. Well, you know what Hubert Davis's 4 years have looked like since he took the Tar Heels to the national championship game? They look almost exactly like the 4-year stretch where Roy Williams ultimately determined unilaterally that those 4 years weren't good enough. And you know what? Hubert's best year, 29 wins, ACC regular season title, Sweet 16 trip, was a perfect match for Roy's best year in his final 4 years. 29 wins, regular season ACC title, Sweet 16 trip. Roy's horrible year, 14-19, was kind of a parallel for Hubert's year where the Heels were preseason number 1, and they become the only team in modern college basketball history to go from preseason number 1 to missing the NCAA tournament entirely. Just as Roy had 2 of those final 4 years kind of in the middle, Hubert had 2 of those, his final recent 4 years, somewhere in the middle. Well, Roy Williams got to determine for himself, it was his decision, this isn't good enough, I'm not the right guy for the job anymore. And of course, at that point, Roy Williams was in his early 70s. Now it's Hubert Davis under a similar set of circumstances. Roy Williams is not going to come out and say these past 4 years haven't met the Carolina standard, because Roy Williams is the guy who handpicked Hubert Davis as his successor in Chapel Hill. But Hubert's 4 years after the national championship game visit very closely match Roy Williams' final 4 years as the head coach of the Tar Heels. And again, Roy summarized those 4 years as not good enough. Hubert's last 4 years, for those reasons we described earlier, blowing big leads. That doesn't happen that often at a place like Carolina. Being on the verge of not making the NCAA tournament that many times, having to squeeze in, even in the year they made the run to the national title game. That falls short of the Carolina standard. 0 ACC championships in 5 years. Only 1 trip to an ACC tournament championship game, and the Heels lost that to the Wolfpack 2 years ago. These round of 64 exits by the Tar Heels. Over a half decade, there weren't enough positives to outweigh a growing list of negatives. And I think if it were a close call, Mike, if the positives and the negatives were really, truly equal, if Hubert Davis seemed comfortable in his own skin, seemed okay with his responsibilities beyond coaching, seemed able to communicate as the public representative of UNC basketball with the media, with those others, if it was a close call after 5 years, and obviously he's a beloved alum, I think he might get the benefit of the doubt. But if he's unhappy with those aspects of his job description, if he's too married to the Carolina way, such that he's excluding outside ideas, basketball or recruiting or budgetary or otherwise, if he's doing too much of those things and the powers that be ask questions that they don't like the answer to, then I do understand that's why you would turn the page and get into a long list of intriguing candidates, some more possible than others, for UNC brand that, remember, still only so many schools that have won 6 NCAA titles or more. Carolina's most recent NCAA title was less than a decade ago. Carolina's had 3 NCAA titles since the turn of the century. There's only a handful of programs that can say that. So I think the UNC basketball brand is super strong, but I also understand why they would consider turning the page on this 5-year Hubert Davis tenure.
My question as a former AD is, did Steve Newmark and Bubba Cunningham go to Greenville, South Carolina last week with this exact thing in mind? Because if they did, I can respect that a little bit more than if one game kind of opened their eyes, because you didn't need one game to open your eyes to all of the things that you just listed out. And my biggest criticism of Carolina athletics over the last 3 years that I've been watching very intently as part of what we do here on the North Carolina Sports Network is that Carolina athletics, Carolina in general, is a very reactive organization. They are not proactive. If you're going to tell me, hey, this wasn't good enough, well, you knew that going in when you had won 24 games, you had gotten bounced in the quarterfinals of the ACC tournament. You knew that. You knew that. So that's the only thing. And we're never going to know that question. But that's the thing right here, because we're seeing a series of reactive things from Carolina athletics. And maybe it's a good time that Bubba Cunningham is starting to go into his sunset of his career in Chapel Hill and Steve Newmark can take over, because you can't run a college athletics program with your major sports being reactive and dating back to the spring of 2024 when Bubba was the victim of a coup d'etat from the Board of Trustees, all the way through everything that went on with the football changeover. We don't need to rehash that. On to the new AD in waiting being announced last July, a guy who had never worked a day in college athletics, had never worked a day in sports outside of motorsports. And as anybody will tell you that's worked in NASCAR right here, they don't like stick and ball people. So that phrase in itself is kind of a trigger thing for me. But it goes back to this. Carolina football is in distress. Carolina basketball now is in distress. And you talk to a lot of people. You've talked to a lot of people who have worn that jersey for Carolina. And it seems like it's concerning to a lot of people, this situation. And I guess is it inevitable now, do you feel? I mean, everybody seems to think that it is. There are a few people out there that think that there is still a chance, kind of like we talked about our friends from Dumb and Dumber. But does this concern you, the overall narrative of being a reactive department, reactive leadership, instead of being proactive and ahead of the curve? And I got to tell you, the people over in Durham are not reactive. They are proactive, and that's why Duke wins.
Yeah, to me, and you ask a great question about, was Hubert Davis on the chopping block prior to that loss to VCU? We may never know that. Remember the NC State story 2 years ago? Was Kevin Keatts automatically going to get fired if the Wolfpack did not win that ACC tournament and end up going on a Final Four run? Probably he was. Are people going to ever admit that publicly? I'm not sure they have, or maybe they never will. So it might take a while for us to learn the answer to the question that you just posed there. But I would love to know, I use the phrase truth serum answers, right? A truth serum answer means you're not thinking about how an answer looks or how it sounds or who it's going to get you in trouble with. You're just going to give the 100% unadulterated truth. And I would love to know Hubert Davis's answer in terms of an unadulterated truth to whether he wanted a general manager at all. Remember, he said publicly that he did. He said publicly that it's time. The old way at Carolina doesn't really work anymore. That's a Hubert Davis quote. Did he believe that when he said it? Because we know for a long time, Bubba Cunningham, the athletic director, said publicly that he was following his coach's lead on whether they needed a general manager or not. When that started to become a thing in college athletics, he would ask his football coach, ask his women's basketball coach, ask his men's basketball coach. And Hubert Davis did not want a GM for a while. Did he still not want one? Henry Vessar was a wonderful addition for the Tar Heels. I mean, world class. Who found him? Who decided he was going to be such a good fit? Who created that role for him? Was it Jim Tanner who identified him? Was it Hubert Davis? And then Jim Tanner followed that lead and negotiated that deal. How did that work? And was Hubert truly comfortable with how that worked in the past and how it was continuing to work moving forward. If I were a decision maker in Chapel Hill, I'd also want to know the truth serum answer to whether Hubert Davis still believes what he said on the day he was hired as Carolina's head coach, and that is, you can't work for me unless you've worn this uniform and lived in this culture. I think that's a really scary proposition in 2026 if Hubert Davis really believes that. I would ask him what he sees as the nature of his relationships with players. I would ask him, does he have a bulldog recruiter on his staff? And if needed, would he go outside the Carolina family to find one? I'm not sure Hubert Davis's truth serum answers to those questions reflect what it takes to win in 2026. And I would be concerned if I were Lee Roberts, the chancellor, or Bubba Cunningham, Steve Newmark, the sort of rotating athletic directors, if you will. And those are the questions you have to ask. But that hierarchy is complicated at Chapel Hill right now. The Board of Trustees has always mattered to some degree. The university chancellor, of course, matters to some degree. But when John Swafford 100 years ago was the UNC athletic director, you didn't have to wonder who was making decisions about these things. It was John Swafford, with deference from the Board of Trustees and from the university president or chancellor. And yes, we live in a world where, heck, politicians get involved and the state legislature gets involved at a public university like UNC. But Lee Roberts is only a third-year chancellor. He's not scouting basketball coaches. Steve Newmark, as you said, comes from NASCAR. He's not scouting basketball coaches. You have to be asking people that you trust, including members of the Carolina family, is Hubert Davis getting outcoached? Was he being outcoached when Kansas made that comeback in the NCAA title game? Was he outcoached while blowing that massive second half lead to VCU? Or sometimes stuff just happens, right? Hubert Davis was 24-6 when Caleb Wilson had his second injury. Well, then they lost at Duke, one and done at the ACC tournament, one and done at the NCAA tournament. Those last three games built the momentum to answer your question about what was, it might not have been in the mind of UNC's hierarchy prior to Caleb Wilson's injury, but losing at Duke, one and done at the ACC tournament, and they were getting murdered by Clemson in that game. We were there until that late comeback made it close. And then you blow the massive lead to VCU. Are there X and O reasons? Are there preparation reasons? Are there how you build a program, how you build a roster reasons that the Tar Heels so often were barely squeaking into the NCAA tournament or failing to win beyond the round of 64? Lee Roberts isn't qualified to answer that question. Neither is Steve Newmark. Bubba Cunningham isn't himself, but he has more experience with coaches and can ask those questions of others. The Carolina family, Mike, doesn't have a good coaching candidate right now. The way, there was a Roy Williams waiting at Kansas years ago, right? Or a Bill Guthridge from Dean Smith's staff being promoted as that longtime assistant. The current Carolina family does not have a ready-made plug-in head coach that wore the uniform or coached under the light brew umbrella, if you will. But they certainly have a whole bunch of basketball minds to say, what do you see as the shortcomings of these last 4 or 5 years? And you got to let that marinate a little bit as you evaluate Hubert Davis. Again, a beloved alum, a universally liked human being. But whereas some schools go into an NCAA tournament knowing if they lose, it's not going to be because they're outcoached. St. John's ain't worried about being outcoached with Rick Pitino at the controls. And there are a handful of ACC schools that feel that way right now. I don't know if UNC feels that way, and that's one of the main reasons that Hubert Davis ultimately ended up on the hot seat, if not before that 3-game slide at the end, certainly at the end of it.
You talk about just the organization of those Carolina basketball minds, and you have a current guy that's working his way up right now in the world of NBA administration, and that is Anton Jameson out of Charlotte. You have former NBA world champion GM and head coach Billy Cunningham. You have former NBA world champion player and general manager Mitch Kupchak. You have guys like Eddie Fogler, Dave Hanners, Phil Ford, people who have been in the coaching fraternity, Larry Brown. The Carolina fans of today, some of them out there taking shots at Larry Brown, who's an Olympic gold medalist, an All-American, an NBA champion, moreover, and an NCAA champion coach. Shut the hell up. I mean, really, I want to evoke Will Smith. Get my name out of your mouth. That kind of stuff. But it goes back. I wrote a column on X called Why Duke Wins. And you look at how Duke is set up and how they get their people involved, how it's very organized. We sat right behind them at the ACC tournament. It is an amazing thing to watch. And you look at Carolina, they have all of this potential and none of it's organized. And it really does cry out that there's not a head of that Carolina basketball family. Hubert Davis wants to be the coach. I don't think he wants that mantle that is crushing him. And I'll go back. I talked about it with Kerry Keating. It was that Monday night game at Clemson 2 years ago and early February. And he looked lost. He looked like, I don't want to be here anymore. He looked like that last year at the ACC tournament after the loss to Duke, this year after the loss to Clemson. He's looked miserable in every setting that I've seen him over the last few years, barring an immediate press conference right after a win. So it's just tough to watch, but it would be nice to see if Carolina is going to make this change, if they really do go all in, if there really is something that Steve Newmark can bring as the athletic director, which is organization to help out whatever coach comes in, because that's a tough job. You talk about coming in here. I think the brand's fine. I think the job is murderous right now. I mean, there is so much right now going on, and the first time that guy gets blitzed, we might have a repeat of somebody being hung in effigy like they were with Dean Smith, and Billy C gets off the bus and rips it down. I mean, this is a real, it's really a tectonic moment in the history of Carolina athletics, because I've racked my brain, and between you and me and my college roommate, the director of athletics at the Citadel, Art Chase, we're three pretty knowledgeable people about Carolina basketball fans. It's kind of odd to talk about a guy who worked at Duke for 25 years as being a definitive historian on Carolina hoops, but Art grew up in Chapel Hill just like Steve Newmark, friends with Steve Newmark. But dude, this is the biggest hire in the history of Carolina athletics. There's nothing in football that remotely comes close to this. This is Carolina basketball. This is the brand. And it's falling on this group of folks, I'm telling you. It's a lot of pressure on them. And people are saying, why don't we know something right now? Because they all know, Lee Roberts knows, Newmark knows, if they screw this up, they're done. They're done, because people will come after them. This is not Carolina football. This is Carolina basketball.
Yeah, it's complicated, Mike. And I know we're going to revisit Duke and get out of here with our Sweet 16 show, but keep this in mind. There's only so much recon you can do ahead of time, right? Carolina's network does include a lot of people who know a lot of coaches. So you can get a feel for how someone might respond if they get a certain phone call. There are the make them say no guys, like Brad Stevens of the Celtics, like Jay Wright, the legendary Villanova coach, like a Billy Donovan now in the NBA with the Chicago Bulls. You make them say no, as they probably will say no, right? If that phone call came. But when you do your other due diligence, keep in mind that when folks throw out Todd Golden at Florida, he has a $16 million buyout. So you'd have to pay $5 million plus to Hubert Davis just to fire him. And then you'd have to pay $16 million buyout before you pay a whole lot of money to Todd Golden or somebody else. Similarly, Nate Oates at Alabama, his buyout is huge right now. It does go down to $10 million after April 1st. Some of the other guys, Ryan Odom, somebody asked me about Ryan Odom at Virginia. He has a $15 million buyout. He's only been with the Cavaliers for 1 year. And most of the time, the way those contracts are written, I can tell you as a contract attorney myself, the buyout is larger if a coach wants to leave after year one or year two, et cetera. Some of the other coaches that could get a call from the Tar Heels, a Dusty May of Michigan, a Grant McCasland of Texas Tech, a Mark Byington of Vanderbilt, Scott Drew of Baylor, a guy who's won a national championship with the Bears. Maybe he wants a fresh start. He's only 55 years old. Those guys have more manageable buyouts, as does a TJ Otzelberger of an Iowa State, for example. But with no obvious candidates in the UNC family, with the make them no, say no guys likely to say no, and with some of those other intriguing candidates having just massive buyouts, that again, you got to pay to get rid of your current staff, pay 8 figures to buy out your new guy, and then pay him an enormous amount of money to be your coach moving forward. That's a lot of financial stress for a school that's spending an unprecedented amount of money on football for the first time in its history and is wrestling with a lot of these revenue sharing, name, image, likeness issues that were just not part of college athletics 10 years ago, 20 years ago, or 50 years ago.
That's enough for the Tar Heels right now. That drama is still unfolding. And again, please stay tuned to your social accounts at the NC Sportsnet, our website, ncsportsnetwork.com. David Glenn and our entire team here at NCSN will be covering all of the developments in Chapel Hill as we steam on through Bacon and basketball month. So back to the tournament as we head into the Sweet 16 DG. Is this tournament wide open, and where do you see Duke ending up after this weekend?
Yeah, Mike, I would not say it's wide open in the sense that, 10 or 12 or 14 of these 16 teams still standing have the ability to win it all. I default back. By the way, I look forward to our follow-up shows. We're diving into the coaching carousel, right? We now have Jerry McNamara in the ACC at Syracuse, his alma mater, where he helped Jim Boeheim and Carmelo Anthony and those guys win a national championship. We also have Scott Cross at Georgia Tech. We're going to have a new guy at Boston College. We'll see how UNC plays out. But in our great state, where there's 19 Division I programs, we have an old friend, Wes Miller, one of the best mid-major coaches ever in our state for what he did at UNC Greensboro. He's now the head coach of the Charlotte 49ers in the American Conference. And we also have another old friend, former UNC assistant Jared Haas, who had success at UAB and was also the head coach at Stanford prior to the Cardinal joining the ACC. He is the new guy at UNC Greensboro. So we're going to be talking with those coaches. So for those interested in those follow-ups, stay tuned here on the North Carolina Sports Network and at ncsportsnetwork.com. Mike briefly mentioned his article about why Duke wins on social media. I'm also posting that at ncsportsnetwork.com. And I've already posted another article that Mike wrote on social media. He called it The Clone Wars. And he does a great job of diving in as a longtime athletic director and assistant AD himself. The Blue Bloods, UCLA and Indiana and North Carolina and Duke and Kentucky, et cetera. What they've done right, what they've done wrong, and the balance between celebrating your history and trying to take the best parts of it without basically losing your way in the modern world by clinging too strongly to so many of the things of the past. So please, I encourage our viewers and listeners here on YouTube and our podcast to check out the website, ncsportsnetwork.com, where Mike has penned some really good work, along with the daily articles that I post there myself. Back to your question, I kind of am back. The reason I won't say wide open, Mike, is I think there are 6 teams that could win it all. And 6 out of 16 doesn't feel like wide open. The same 3 number 1 seeds that I circled for our viewers and listeners before the tournament, I liked in order: Arizona, then Michigan, then Duke. And then my 3 favorite number 2 seeds in order: Houston and UConn and Iowa State. I think the national champion is going to come from among those 6 teams because I think everybody else has some kind of flaw. Either they don't play defense enough, they don't have a go-to scorer, they don't have the right coach or whatever. So not wide open, but I think the national champion comes from one of those 6. And when it comes to the Duke Blue Devils, I don't think this is going to be their year because of the question marks, the flaws to go along with a long list of strengths. If John Shire pulls off a national championship this year, I think because of the injuries, because of the up and down outside shooting, because of the less than ideal point guard situation, I think it would be even more impressive than if he had won the national championship a year ago with Cooper Flagg and Con Knipple and the rest of that group, which arguably just had more high-end talent with, of course, so many of those guys ending up in the NBA draft. Heck, all 5 starters ending up in the NBA draft for the Duke Blue Devils a year ago. I still think Arizona is the team to beat. Tommy Lloyd's a great coach. They have a great senior point guard. They have international talent. They have some inside-outside balance. They have some offense-defense balance. It'll be intriguing to see how former Tar Heel Elliot Cadeau does leading the Michigan Wolverines. They have a good coach in Dusty May. They have big guy in Yaxel Lendeborg. But Elliot Cadeau is kind of an X factor for the Wolverines. In many ways, he's playing better for Michigan than he did for UNC, but he is not as consistently great as maybe a national championship seeking team needs him to be. Will he rise to the occasion? Will he be a weak link? Will he be an X factor? We'll see. And then, of course, I'm watching Kelvin Sampson, 70 years old, state of North Carolina guy, not many chances left, but he has a really, really good team. And I'm fascinated to see how John Shire does in that bracket we outlined earlier, where it's Rick Pitino of St. John's in the Sweet 16. And if you beat the Red Storm, you've got either Dan Hurley and UConn waiting for you or Tom Izzo and Michigan State waiting for you. This is not an easy path for the Blue Devils. For the purposes of the North Carolina Sports Network, we root for any of our state's 19 teams to go as far as possible. Gives us more to talk about for a longer period well into the month of April. So good luck to the Blue Devils. I won't be surprised if Duke is one of the Final Four teams still standing. I have Duke in my Final Four on our public bracket in our Bacon and Basketball Challenge at Yahoo Sports this year. I have a pretty good bracket so far. We'll see if I don't think I'm eligible to win free bacon for a year. So if I do finish first, I will hand that baton to somebody else. But we have a lot of fun storylines to follow, Mike. And as I said, even if Duke, as the only state of North Carolina team still alive, given those great stories like Queens and High Point that ended on the first weekend of the NCAA tournament from beyond the Atlantic Coast Conference, even if the Blue Devils don't make it, we have a lot to talk about, given the coaching carousel, given the opening of the transfer portal in early April. And that is, of course, as important as anything else. 12 months of high school recruiting is important, but it is a really brief transfer portal window that keeps getting smaller and smaller with each passing year as they change NCAA rules. So when these balls stop bouncing in the NCAA tournament, we're not going to run out of topics here at the North Carolina Sports Network. But I'm glad we still have so many big games and big stories worth following, like those we mentioned a little bit earlier in today's show.
This is the North Carolina Sports Network. From the high country to the Outer Banks, on courts, fields, and fairways, we tell the stories of the bold North State. Follow us on social media at the NC Sportsnet. We're the exclusive home of The David Glenn Show, coach-driven analysis of football and basketball. A look at the past with This Was Then, Inside NIL with Court Vision, the North Carolina Sports Awards, aka the Pineys, and the Old North State Tailgate, where we are on the ground at North Carolina's top events. Our foundational partner is NC Pork, raising the bacon, raising the bar. Telling the stories of the bold North State. Experience matters. This is NCSN, the North Carolina Sports Network.